forgive me if I'm putting you on the spot, but I had this opportunity, so I want to ask you this question. It's again on human subjectivity. Are you familiar with a philosopher? He's a continental philosopher called Slavoj Žižek. You're probably familiar, right? So I'm a big fan of his work. And just on a side note, when you spoke, when I read your book for the first time, and when you kind of introduced the idea of the iron rule, my mind or my head straight away went to what he talks about, this thing called the socio-symbolic order. And he kind of defines that as a virtual category where it's not that it's a subjective stance that exists in the human in an individual human psyche, but rather he views it as this kind of virtual reality. It's not something material or substantial, but as a result of individual human beings interacting socially in the world, there's like this symbolic order that emerges. And that's the way I view in many ways, the iron rule of explanation, where no, it's not someone somewhere said, this is what the iron rule is, nor is it written down in, like, I don't know, from God above saying this is what the iron rule is. It kind of like emerges from our social interactions. But I wonder if I could read a little excerpt from his book, Absolute Recoil, which is like a book on Hegel. And I wonder if I could get your kind of reaction to it, if that's okay. So this is from Absolute Recoil, and this is on the human subject. And here's what he says, right? And given that you're more of an analytical philosopher, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. He says, the subject is the immense absolute power of negativity, the power of introducing a gap or cut into the given immediate substantial unity, the power of differentiating, of abstracting, of tearing apart, and treating as self-standing what in reality is part of an organic unity. So what are your initial views on that kind of statement?
Well, just going on what you read, that sounds a little bit along the lines of the view I was myself promoting a few minutes ago, when I was saying that it seems like the subjectivity, as the way we experience it, as being really making us completely different and in a certain important way separate from the world, is a kind of a construction. The reality is something more like the scientific world picture, where we're systems like bottles and telescopes and AIs and so on. I'm not sure if that's what Žižek actually means by that passage, but it sounds somewhat in accordance with it.
I see, yeah, because I think Žižek is certainly not unlike certain continental philosophers. He doesn't play the whole postmodernist game, where I hate that, honestly. Like, oh, it's just another episteme, it's just another domain of way of viewing the world. The question I guess he'll pose, if I could speak for him, would be, in this world of objects, in a world of, as you said, bottles, atoms, whatever you may call it, how is it that subjectivity emerges? As in, what causes us beings to emerge, where we suddenly become self-conscious and then we start abstracting out and doing such things? Have you got any views on that?
So it sounded like his, at least the view he was suggesting in those sentences, was it's almost like just a kind of an arbitrary cut that puts me on one side of the barrier. And
yes, arbitrary cut. That's it. Yeah, but how is it that it's us, the subject, and then the world out there? It's a weird thing, because I'm sure this pen doesn't feel that. It doesn't feel that it's the pen and then the world out there.
Yeah, it seems. I mean, I feel that it's not. It doesn't seem like it's something we do to the world. It seems like something that gets foisted on us, this subjectivity. We just come into the world kind of, and it impresses itself on us in this way that makes us very much the perceiver, and then of course soon enough the agent. And we're not choosing it. We're just thrust into that position, as though the cut, if we're just going along with the cut thing, as though the cut is made for us by, well, I don't know. You mentioned evolutionary theory. I didn't quite get to answer that question, I realized. but of course we can't talk about everything.
Fair enough.
Maybe the cut is, as it were, a sort of part of our inheritance as human beings, or as some broader class of beings. Maybe large numbers of mammals have the same cut, and maybe the class is even larger than that. Who knows?
Yeah.
And it's a kind of it becomes, even if we're just another system, it's very important to being to dealing with the world, to being a effective agent in the world, to conceive of yourself as an effective agent, not in an intellectualized way, but just to kind of face the world as a series of decisions to be made about actions to be performed, which is a very different way of thinking about yourself than the scientific picture where, like any physical system, you're just subject to the laws of nature and the virtue of your physical makeup. So this whole psychology of agency is something that's prepared for us, if you like, from the very beginning, from birth, and we just step into it whether we like it or not, and find ourselves in what appears to be at least the captain's seat.
Certainly. No, Professor, I think Žižek would agree with you, because what's interesting is he kind of views human subjectivity the same way. He's like, oh, we don't choose to be human subjects. He even says, in fact, it's kind of a hellish experience. Jean-Paul Sartre said that we are condemned to be free, where we kind of are in this world and now we have to choose. Whereas the scientific worldview, if everything were just objects, then those objects, that we don't prescribe any kind of agency onto them. But then again, here's where these things get interesting. If we build AGI, wouldn't we be prescribing this kind of subjectivity onto AGIs? And suddenly, at one point, the quote unquote the singularity, now the AGI is going to have this cut, this arbitrary cut in reality, where it feels it's me and then the world out there.
Well, here's a reason to think no, actually, because if you imagine that AGI will so. Actually, I think a lot of people are skeptical about this.
Oh, yeah, so am I. Yeah,
who are big AI proponents. But if you imagine it actually working like ChatGPT, in an LLM way, that in a way that's a very different way of dealing with the complexity of the world and being as I said, in a sort of effective in the world, than sort of feeling yourself as thinking of yourself as a decision maker who's reacting to discrete events by deciding to act in certain ways. Something like ChatGPT is, I mean, this is a bit metaphorical, I suppose, but it's not really thinking in that one-dimensional serial way. Rather, it's kind of thinking what word comes next, what action comes next, based on a million different considerations. And it might be that even if such a intellect could be conscious, it wouldn't experience itself as an agent. Maybe it would just experience itself as a prediction machine. It would be like,
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Rather than thinking of itself as something that was free to perform actions, it would just be something that thought of itself as this kind of pure predictor of what the next best thing is.
Yeah. It's funny. I wonder if that's what God is ultimately. The problem with there's this theological notion. I think it was Augustine who said that. But the one limitation God has is that God has no limitations. So that's what we humans have over God, where we in fact feel that but we're here now. Now we need to predict. We don't really know what the future holds, and we need to act and kind of live in this world. But no,
so our agency may come from a sort of a very narrowness.
Yes, exactly. Come from our affinity in that sense.
Cognitive simplicity.
Yeah. But thank you, Professor, for humoring me with that. I really appreciate you letting me ask you about Žižek, because I know like a lot of, especially people like Noam Chomsky are very critical of like Continental philosophy and kind of European the way of thinking. But I find there's great depth and insight into their way of thinking too.